From the Prairies to the Trenches, Part III. Women's Suffrage to the Somme, December 1915 to December 1916. By Christmas of 1915, the men of the Canadian Expeditionary Force took up positions near Ypres, where they were reinforced by the newly formed 2nd and 3rd Divisions. The combined force was redesignated the Canadian Corps. It was a force which underlined Canada's commitment to the Empire and also signified that their men would remain together and fight under a unified command instead of simply being dispersed among British formations. After the spontaneous and unauthorized Christmas truce of 1914, fraternization with the enemy was expressly forbidden by the British High Command. Nevertheless, in several sectors along the line, Allied troops and those from the Central Powers defied these orders and quietly emerged from their trenches on Christmas Day. The men from both sides met in no man's land, extending well wishes and sharing, however briefly, the sentiments of goodwill and the hope for peace. Victor Swanston, Christmas Day, 1915.
They are men just like us. They don't want war. We shared our Christmas parcels with them. They showed us pictures of their families, pointing and talking in German, with tears running down their faces.
Nonetheless, it would take almost 3 more years of bloodshed, with millions dead, for Western Europe to know peace again. Over the winter of 1916, 50,000 Canadians held a 6-mile front just south of the Ypres salient. They suffered the miseries of waterlogged trenches, bitterly cold winds, and an overextended front line. In general, British units at the front rotated from the support trenches to the front line, and then into reserve in 6-day segments. Nonetheless, the extensive sector which the Canadians occupied meant that no unit could be away from the front line for too long, making the recovery time short and the wear on the troops significant. The casualties suffered by the Canadians over their first year at the front were staggering, and it soon became apparent that there was no end in sight. As early as the autumn of 1915, a crisis was forming, where both the heavy losses and the expansion of the Canadian contingent were fast outstripping the number of new recruits. The only thing to be done was to try to accelerate enlistments at home. From the beginning of hostilities in 1914, many men from First Nations communities across Saskatchewan wanted to serve. The Canadian government was initially reluctant to recruit Aboriginals, as they were considered wards of the state and so not obligated to defend the British Empire. This did not deter the resolute few who were eager to join the ranks and, quote, fight for the Great White Father. Others displayed their patriotism by participating in the Red Cross and supporting various fundraising drives. Over 3,500 Aboriginal men enlisted for active service during World War I. This number represented around a third of the eligible Aboriginal male population at that time, meeting and often exceeding the average per capita enlistments among the regional white communities in Canada. They enlisted for a variety of reasons, some out of patriotism, some to bring honor to their communities, while others simply craved adventure outside of their reserves, to see other countries and other people. Men from First Nations communities served in all branches of military service, but gained particular distinction as scouts and snipers, roles in which they drew heavily on their skills as hunters and outdoorsmen. Alexander Brass, from the File Hills colony in Saskatchewan, was the leader of the community's brass band. The band assisted in patriotic gatherings, Red Cross meetings, and recruitment rallies. After playing in a particularly apathetic town where only a few of the audience had signed up, the band announced that they would enlist as a whole, which they did on January 12, 1916. Alexander was assigned to the 5th Battalion and served as a scout, and later was awarded the Military Medal for gallantry. Alexander de Coteau, from the Red Pheasant First Nation, whose father had fought against the Canadian militia in the 1885 Riel Resistance, enlisted in April 1916. He was the first Aboriginal police officer in Canada and had gained fame as a runner, representing Canada in the 5,000-meter race at the 1912 Olympic Games in Stockholm. While men of the First Nations began to stream into the ranks, many Canadians began to cast a suspicious eye to those who had immigrated from the areas controlled by the Central Powers. These minorities were increasingly discriminated against by their fellow countrymen. This enmity was not limited to the streets. As early as 1914, the Canadian government began to scrutinize those they would call enemy aliens, forcing their registration with local magistrates, observing their movements, and even forcing some individuals into internment camps. Jacob Miller, a recruit from Neudorf, Saskatchewan, and a member of the 45th Battalion, found himself the object of distrust because of his Austrian ancestry, with several of his fellow soldiers questioning both his loyalty and his reasons for serving.
I felt certain, after having been cross-questioned by the orderly sergeant, that I was the unfortunate victim of suspicion and was filled with gloomy apprehension. Ted tried to enlighten me by saying that it was all a mistake which would soon be rectified. The other fellows did not show the same faith in me, but positively believed me to be a spy. Their suspicions were plainly evinced by their hostile attitudes, for they hardly spoke to me and shunned me at every opportunity.
Back at home, women's suffrage was gaining momentum throughout the Prairie provinces, with various organizations canvassing and petitioning for women to have the right to vote. Political speakers and suffrage literature circulated across the Prairies, educating both men and women that granting the vote to women would provide them with a greater voice to protect their families' interests, improve their legal rights, and support their men at the front. Many women's organizations joined forces, creating the Women's Equal Franchise League, seeking enfranchisement as a means to address the concerns within their own respective groups, such as the sale and distribution of alcohol. Violet McNaughton, president of the women's section of the Grain Growers Association, recalls the final events in achieving the vote.
Finally, in May 1915, around 100 representative men and women submitted a huge suffrage petition to Premier Walter Scott in the Saskatchewan Legislative Chamber. Premier Scott was sympathetic. He promised us serious consideration, but said the government would like more signatures. We secured them. Early in March 1916, I received a letter from Premier Scott promising that an equal franchise bill would be brought down at the next session of the House. It was. It had been a good campaign, difficult, exciting, successful.
On March 14, 1916, women were given the legal right to vote in provincial elections on equal terms with men. Later that year, women would exercise their new rights when the matter of prohibition was decided. In Europe, as the titanic struggle for Verdun waged to the east, on the 27th of March 1916, the British detonated a series of huge mines dug under the German trenches near the village of St. Eloi. The linked explosions created 7 large craters and completely changed the surrounding landscape, with the largest being about 50 feet deep and close to 200 feet across. These craters and the debris they created made it virtually impossible for the attacking British to find suitable cover or keep their bearings during their assault. The attack foundered, and on April the 4th, with the British nearing exhaustion, the untested Canadian 2nd Division, which included the doughty 28th Northwest Battalion, was sent in to replace them. From the 4th to the 17th of April, the Canadians fought in a horrific cratered landscape, where confusion and miscommunication reigned. While the fighting was ferocious, many of the men were made casualties by the environment itself. Lieutenant Robert Coombe, a pharmacist from Melville, Saskatchewan, was pulled from the front after contracting rheumatism and lumbago while fighting amongst cold, sodden shell holes, which were often choked with human remains. In early June, the Germans mounted their own attack on the Canadian sector at Mont Sorel. The initial assault killed the 3rd Division's commander and threw the Canadians back off the high ground, exposing the deep salient to greater German observation. On June the 4th, a company of the 28th Northwest Battalion Saskatchewan men was wiped out when the Germans exploded 4 underground mines under the 2nd Division positions, of which they were a part. In response, the Canadians sent in a series of counterattacks, the first of which failed, but the second, planned methodically by General Arthur Currie, finally took back the lost ground. By the end of the Battle of Mount Sorrel, in a little under 2 weeks, the Canadian Corps had suffered over 8,000 casualties. On June the 5th, 1916, Dick Richardson from Grenfell, Saskatchewan, wrote to his friend Edna Chapman regarding the action at Mount Sorrel.
Dear Edna, perhaps you have heard something about the time we have been having. I hope I never have to go through it again. It was simply hell. Our regiment was almost obliterated. About 40 of us came back out of the 2 companies that held the front line. Number 1 company on our right were all either killed or taken prisoner. Not a single man came back. Number 2, which is the company I was in, were able to hold them off all day and all night until their artillery leveled all our trenches and left us with only 40 men, many of the wounded. They got through the trenches on our right and got behind us, opening up machine guns from both sides so that we were forced to retire on our left over 400 yards of open country, with the whole of it a mass of flame from bursting shells and swept by machine guns. I had to crawl most of the way, as a piece of shrapnel early in the day had put me out of commission, opening up my right side to the depth of my ribs and about 5 inches long and 2 inches wide. That is why I am now holding down one of the comfortable beds here in Boulogne, having been brought down by train last night. Next time I write, I shall be in England. I expect, for my ticket reads that way. It is such a relief to get away from bursting shells that even as helpless as I am, this is like heaven.
After the costly battles of the spring and early summer, the Canadians were held in reserve as the Great Battle of the Somme was launched on July the 1st. The Somme consumed men at a horrific rate, with the British suffering over 57,000 casualties on the first day alone. Not gaining the success anticipated, General Haig sustained the battle through the summer and into the autumn of 1916. With the British Army being bled white and nearing exhaustion, the Canadian Corps was committed to the Somme campaign, beginning in September and extending until the end of November. This would be the first taste of action for members of the 46th Battalion, who were part of the 4th Division coming into line during the late summer. The Somme was a truly eye-opening experience for the 46th. Arriving after the slaughter of the previous months of fighting, the battalion found itself witnessing some harrowing sights, as Harold Emery recalls.
I caught up with 8 men of the 50th in a ditch and stayed with them for several long hours. A stretcher-bearer was moving around, binding up men wounded in no man's land, until he got hit in the head by a sniper and fell only a few feet from me. I crawled out and dragged him back into our ditch when I heard him groaning. I found myself pushing some brains back into his head and bound him up. He never became fully conscious but raved about his wife, Mary. I never believed I could forget his name when I examined his identity disc. I took over his job and bound up all the wounded 50th men who reached the ditch, and over the hours at least a dozen men safely reached Regina Trench, all 50th Battalion men. I never did know if any of them even mentioned this incident, so very vivid to me, and had kept with me as long as I've lived.
On the 18th of November, the Canadians attacked in sleet and freezing rain, groping their way forward in cold mud. It was a wonder in circumstances so bad that they could make any headway at all, and it is a testament to their physical stamina, self-sacrifice, and determination that they achieved what they did. Towards the end of the Canadians' tour on the Somme, infantry battalions had as much as 8 miles to march to the trenches from their billets. From this, the men's clothing became so coated with mud that it often weighed up to 120 pounds by the time they reached the front lines. It was a miserable, exhausting, and terrifying experience. From all of this, even though the Canadians had achieved some local gains, the Somme campaign ground down to a bloody stalemate. The Battle of the Somme caused 24,029 Canadian casualties. By the end of the year, the Somme, St. Eloi, and Mount Sorel served as hard-earned lessons for the Canadian Corps. They had learned, under extreme duress, the value of proper planning, constant training, and precise communications between formations, lessons that would later bear fruit in the battles of 1917 and 1918. Meanwhile, in Saskatchewan, many people felt that the overconsumption of alcohol had become a serious social problem, contributing to crime, financial stress, and domestic violence. In December 1916, a vote was called on the prohibition of alcohol within Saskatchewan. This would be the first time women within the province were able to exercise their recently achieved enfranchisement. The result was that a majority of the province was in favor of the abolishment of the sale and distribution of liquor. From this landmark decision, Saskatchewan became the first province to declare prohibition as government policy. For Saskatchewan farmers, even though 1915 had been a bumper crop year, the shortage of railway cars and the disruption of ocean shipping meant that almost none of the 1915 crop had been shipped out of the country, or even out of the province, before the crop of 1916 came in. This caused considerable hardship on the farmers, who found it increasingly difficult to get their grain to market. The battles of 1916 were unprecedented in their bloodshed. High casualties suffered by the Canadian Corps led to a manpower shortage that was becoming increasingly difficult to resolve. As a result, the dreaded subject of conscription rose to the forefront in the social and political debates in Canada. From this, conflicting messages were being communicated to Saskatchewan farmers by the government regarding their wartime role. On one hand, they were asked to provide men for fighting at the front, while on the other they were constantly reminded that they needed to increase crop production, an activity which required significant manpower. These two tensions would increase to a boiling point in the coming year. 1916 came to a close with the end of the war nowhere in sight, and its cost in blood and material continuing to rise. For many in Saskatchewan, the Christmas season was tainted by the knowledge that yet more sacrifice would be demanded of them in the year to come.